my name is Dustin Wells, and I'm CEO of Headspring and co-founder of Workify. I'm really excited to have you join us today for this conversation with our guest. This is the third of a three-part series on conscious leadership, and our goal in these sessions is to help leaders think about how they're showing up and to challenge you to find different ways to level up your leadership through deliberate and intentional action. Session 1, we covered leading with action, and session 2, we covered leading with purpose. And in this session, we have a great guest where we're going to talk about leading with consciousness. While we have a guest here and I'm going to facilitate the conversation, it's important to note that this is something we want everyone to participate in. So I encourage you all to ask questions throughout, and I'll remind you. Also, our guests can ask me questions if something comes up, and I want to welcome that opportunity as well. So with that said, let me introduce our guest. He is an academic and an entrepreneur, which typically don't go together. So that's impressive. And he was working on his PhD and decided to table that to pursue changing the world through business. He is also the CEO of Conscious Capitalism, and I'll let him tell us a little bit about that organization. And I'm really excited to have you here today because a conscious world starts with conscious leaders. And I'd like everyone to welcome Alexander. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you, Dustin. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
For sure. Well, let's jump in and get started. I want to just start from your perspective because you have a unique view as not only a leader of an organization, but also a leader of leaders. And most of your members are executives that also have a similar mindset. But why is this topic of conscious leadership so important today?
So, conscious leadership is becoming such an important topic, not only because it's the right thing to do, it always has been, it's been the best kind of leadership, but more and more people in the world are recognizing and demanding conscious leadership from anyone who considers themselves a leader, and even from people that may not consider themselves leaders, but others look to them that way. In the world of business, for example, for a long time, there was this concept of business's purpose being to maximize profit that some still adhere to. But more people are demanding, whether it's employees, customers, the community, or even shareholders, that businesses adopt a higher purpose and use profit to fulfill that purpose, and demanding that leaders in those businesses come in with a mindset of consciousness, of creating a better world and fulfilling that higher purpose as the reason that they're a leader, not just having an analytic focus on solving one problem independent of its relationship to people. So this is the right thing to do. This is the best kind of leadership, and it's something that the world is insisting upon from all leaders as the future of leadership.
Well, if the world is pushing us in that direction, like when do you think that trend started and why?
So I think there have always been conscious leaders in history. When we talk about luminaries, whether it's in politics, society, business, it's often people that were considered conscious leaders in their time, where they understood the needs of other individuals around them. They took the time to be present with them. They were thinking not only about solving an analytic problem, but its ripple effect and the higher purpose they were serving. But the idea of conscious leadership as a way of really thinking about leadership in a formal structure, I would really tie to the early 2000s and the late 2000s, and say the 2008 economic crisis as a time when people started to really consider conscious leadership as a priority, because there was this gap in the world, or at least this perception that there was a gap, that a lack of conscious leadership, a lack of conscious capitalism was one of the contributing factors to the economic crisis that we faced back then. And since then, we've seen lots of approaches and lots of organizations and efforts spring up, and more leaders adopt a conscious approach in reaction to that.
Yeah, I feel like this is definitely a rising tide, and I love the 2008 timeframe because I think that was where my journey started around then, around the rise of purpose over the rise of productivity, right? Just to compare two really stark differences. But I think there's still not critical mass from conscious leaders. And what is the challenge to people today that want to start thinking in this mindset? Like, how can they pursue the next step and whatever that might look like for them?
I agree. I don't think we're at a critical mass yet of conscious leaders. I think we're reaching a tipping point more quickly than I expected, though. I think this global public health and economic and leadership crisis that we are facing right now is pushing more people to conscious leadership and conscious capitalism because they realize the old way of doing things won't work going forward. We're talking about a new normal, not returning to normal, but creating a new normal, and conscious leadership being a critical part of that. So what I'm seeing in talking with leaders is that more of them are recognizing this change is happening, and they may not fully understand it, they may not be practicing it yet, but they know they're going to need to. And so the biggest thing that we need to offer them, and that I'm seeing leaders asking for, is practical how-to actions, models that they're able to emulate, resources they're able to learn from, practices to implement. Because we're getting to a point where people are starting to realize this is the right way forward, but they're asking, how do I do it? Because they don't know how to do it on their own necessarily.
What are some examples of some of those tools or models that you think would be most valuable, whether someone's really far down the road or someone's just getting started?
So some tools that are helpful are going to presentations and talking with other conscious leaders, just that you're able to have conversations kind of like what we're doing right now to better understand what it means, as well as then looking at case studies and examples of what they've done in their own businesses that can be uplifted in another leader's organization. So for example, Bob Chapman at Barry Waymiller has been very focused on taking his emphasis on conscious leadership and conscious culture, and really the connection to conscious culture from leadership, and turned it into a book, Everybody Matters, worked with professors to develop a case study around it that other business leaders can learn from, and develop even a training institute that goes along with it in order to help more businesses and leaders adopt a mindset of everybody matters and a truly human leadership approach. And yeah.
But yeah, you started to talk about conscious culture, and I'm wondering if that's the right time to kind of jump there. But since you brought it up, I'd love to segue there and then maybe jump back to more personal strategies as well. But what are some of the highlights of creating a conscious culture, and what is the difference between that versus kind of a standard culture that you might think of?
Conscious leadership and conscious culture are so intertwined with each other for leaders of organizations, because it's very difficult. I would put it as it's very difficult to have only one or the other, to have conscious leadership without a conscious culture, because conscious culture is a result of conscious leadership thinking very intentionally about that culture. And what I mean by culture is the daily actions, morals, ways of talking, just habits of individuals in an organization beyond what's written down in any plan or the business model or strategy. And we think about how an organization is structured so often by just looking at the business plan or the strategy deck. But the way a business is actually structured and operates is so much more than that. That's the culture. And a normal culture is one that has just developed over time. Perhaps it's just focused on sales, or it's just focused on what's produced by the company, which are important. But you can also have a culture that really thinks about the people involved in the organization and creating opportunities for them to bring their full selves to work and create an empowering environment where people actually leave work at the end of the day more inspired, more personally fulfilled and developed, and better human beings than they were at the start of the day when they showed up at their business.
Yeah. So we got a question, and I want you to tee something up that's related to this question. And this is just a good reminder for anyone that is listening live to please submit questions as something comes to you. But this is around the 4 tenets of conscious capitalism. And so if you could just segue a little bit into what those are, and then the question specifically talks about how do you lead with this perspective, even though you may have other stakeholders, board members, maybe even other executives that are really using the conscious capitalism or the conscious leadership moniker, but they aren't really authentically adopting that. And so they're really more worried about capitalism in the traditional sense of money and productivity and other things. So how do you really balance that? So start with the tenets, and then let's maybe segue into how we deal with leaders that might not be quite as aligned.
Yeah, so we started to actually get ahead of ourselves here and started talking about some of the tenets already. But starting with a 50,000-foot view, conscious capitalism is a way of thinking about business and capitalism that emphasizes the human nature of these endeavors. And running a conscious business involves operating on 4 tenets or having 4 values that drive the organization: higher purpose, stakeholder orientation, conscious leadership, and conscious culture. Now, we've been talking a little bit about conscious leadership and conscious culture already, but I'll get back to conscious leadership in a moment. Higher purpose means recognizing that the purpose of business is something different from maximizing profit or making money. That's not to say that profit is bad. Profit's a great thing. You need profits to build a business and to grow it, but that's not the end goal. You use profits to fulfill a higher purpose in the world. It could be taking care of your employees. It could be environmental sustainability. It could be any number of things, but it's recognizing that profit is the means to that end, not the end itself. Stakeholder orientation is a mindset that we should be creating win-win-win solutions for everyone that we touch, instead of thinking that in order to benefit some individuals from a company, you have to make a trade-off to harm someone else, or that one stakeholder group, say shareholders, is the only group that matters and every other group exists to serve them. It's recognizing that we can have instead of just slicing up a pie and dividing up the slices between individuals and thinking, oh, if you're going to give a bigger slice to someone, you have to give someone else a smaller slice. We should bake a bigger pie and help everyone out and find those synergies where everyone wins.
That sounds really nice, but like, tell me a real example of that done well and maybe done poorly.
I take it that there are lots of times where it's done poorly, and that's sort of the standard way of thinking about business, where you think in terms of trade-offs, costs, and benefits. And so if you're going to benefit customers with lower prices, you're going to have to squeeze your suppliers, perhaps. Or if you're going to help get your shareholders get a better return, you have to squeeze your employees, or any number of combinations like that. But there are great examples of finding synergies between all stakeholders. In fact, that really is the premise of business: engaging in exchange with one another in ways where everyone is better off. And we have to, and that is the foundation of business itself, but it's forgotten a lot of times. And this can lead to really interesting results where you do get to win-win-win situations that are creative and interesting, not obvious at first, but still do benefit everyone, even if you wouldn't have thought of it to begin with, or at the face of it, it sounds kind of crazy. So, for example, Vital Farms is one of the companies in the Conscious Capitalism Network. They just went public this past Friday. They produce free-range eggs sold in, say, Whole Foods and other grocery stores. Great eggs, incredible company, started on conscious capitalist principles. And about 7 years ago, perhaps, I might be wrong on the timeline, they actually used a stakeholder orientation lens to make a very difficult decision to decide not to work with some of their suppliers anymore for eggs because they weren't meeting their standards. And even as they were making that decision, they asked themselves, how do we make this a win for those suppliers that we're cutting off? And engaged in a dialogue with them, explaining their reasoning why they didn't want to maintain the relationship anymore, but wanting to support them, and actually helping their suppliers out in trying to operate on their own for competitors for them, but in such a way where Vital Farms knew that they were going to actually do better as a result of maintaining their high standards and selling the kinds of eggs that they wanted to, and allowing these suppliers they weren't going to work with anymore to develop eggs and work with others that they didn't want to, which was a really interesting approach to ending a relationship that normally would be tense, disappointing, but actually created a win for all parties involved.
Yeah, so in that example, it sounds like it wasn't necessarily the decision for Vital Farms to do that was framed within the stakeholder orientation, but we've all maybe changed vendors at times. It was the way that they did it, and the reason they did it that really made it part of this framework. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that defines conscious capitalism versus some other approaches to looking at business, and what I think is actually key to conscious leadership as well. It's an emphasis on process more than the end result.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can take two conscious capitalists, two conscious leaders that work with the same set of values, the same perspective, and they might come out with different results for how they would do things, the kinds of businesses they would run. We have a diversity of businesses and leaders in the conscious capitalism network, but they're all committed to the same set of values and the same process of doing right by everyone that they interact with, and stay committed to that through difficult situations, and giving themselves the time and the resources to really figure out what is going to benefit everyone and fulfill their purpose, really thinking about the process they're using to guide them to get to the best result.
Yeah, and so we had another question come in, and this was sort of the same vein of the first question, which we haven't quite gotten to yet. Is it possible to be a conscious capitalist or a conscious leader, and even though others might not adopt that mindset? So maybe I have certain partners, certain employees, certain shareholders that either think that mindset is good, but they don't really intuitively believe in it or authentically really follow that, or they just outwardly disagree with it. Like, how do we practice conscious leadership and help either operate in an environment where we have some of that discord, or how do we help convert some of these people into this better way of thinking, which we think it's a better way, but how do we move them over there?
So I think we've all had the experience where we know we're interacting with people that may not share our values, share our perspective, or if we're trying to be conscious leaders, they're not. And just because they're not doing that, they don't have the same intention, or perhaps they're not doing it as effectively as us, or we think that's the case, that doesn't lower the bar for ourselves. That doesn't mean we should give up on the attempt to be conscious leaders in the work. It creates a different set of circumstances as to how you express that conscious leadership and how you work through it, but it doesn't change the requirement to do it. And so the last thing I'll say is that for me, for example, I always come back to myself and just ask, what am I in control of? I may not be able to create the perfect situation because I don't control other people, but I can control my attitude, my values, my actions, and always bring it back to what would be the conscious leadership approach in this situation. Try to do that as much as possible. And yeah, I'm curious what you think about that, Dustin. Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating sometimes because we operate from this mindset at both my companies, and we get burned sometimes to the point of some of these questions. And I think what I heard you saying is it's about how we relate to what's happening. That's really important. And I'll still choose to do the right thing, or to do the thing that was in alignment with my values. I don't want to put a value judgment on right and wrong. I'll do the things that align with our values, even if we have a client that might not feel the same way, or an employee or another stakeholder. But it is frustrating, and I think that taking a different approach like this will definitely present challenges to test your resolve towards this approach. And that's
And
what we.
I mean, what comes up for me when you say that, you're right. You can get burned with this approach if others are not acting in a conscious way. But I'm not saying that being a conscious leader is cost free. It actually is asking you to do more and sometimes pay a higher price than others because that's what's required to be committed to the right things or to your values. It has a cost to it. But then also acting on your values and acting consciously doesn't mean to act from a position of ignorance or to pretend something doesn't exist isn't going to be the case. For example, to take a line from one of my favorite philosophers, Tupac Shakur, forgive but don't forget. It doesn't mean be dumb. It means be smart and take all of the information you have available into account. So you may know you're working with someone who doesn't share your values, who is not going to act consciously. And so the question then becomes, what's the best way to follow your values in that situation, knowing they're going to do something different, knowing that they may try to burn you?
Yeah, and I think what we started to hit on, and I'd love to dive into this a little bit, because being a conscious leader really starts with how you show up and what you believe as an individual. And I want to use the term leader really loosely. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a CEO of an organization or a leader of a team or a manager. In all aspects of life, we all are called to show up in different ways as a leader. And I think for me, one of the core tenets of conscious leadership is really about self-awareness and intention. And I know that you believe that as well, just based on past conversations, but can you expand on that a little bit about if you agree or disagree, or what else would you add to that?
I wholeheartedly agree. The idea that leadership comes with a title or position is an antiquated concept in my mind. Every person is a leader. We all lead our own lives. We all have the opportunity to lead other people and do lead them, whether we realize it or not, with both positive and negative ripple effects from that. So we need to start from the premise that every person is a leader and every person is being called to be a conscious leader in the 21st century.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is a barrier for some people, especially with maybe a more traditional mindset, are the words that we use as we think about conscious leadership. And in our last webinar, the word love came up in a company setting. Empathy comes up, mindfulness comes up. Like, these are some examples of words that get thrown around very easily at maybe a conscious capitalism conference, but would make some leaders uncomfortable or make them think, well, that's not a fit for me. Those are separate things. Like, how do we bring those types of concepts into the workplace in a way that all of us can relate to them in the right way?
Well, tell me if you disagree, but I think everyone understands love and empathy is just a part of the human condition. And that actually businesses that run on love and empathy do better than those that don't. People want to be fully human. They want to bring their full selves to work. And when they're able to, that creates the opportunity for them to actually perform better as well. So it's not a question of sacrificing financial or traditional business success in order to bring love, empathy, and heart into business. It's actually a way of doing better, that this will make you a better business. And I'm curious what your reaction is to that, Dustin, if that's what you've seen in your work.
Yeah, I feel like love and especially the word love, right, in a business setting is rarely used. And that's why last time we dove into that a little bit. But what I heard you say and I think that there's a place for all of those words, by the way. But I think what really you said that stuck out to me was that it's about people bringing their whole selves to work, and creating an environment where people feel comfortable doing that. Because without congruence of who you are at work and who you are at home, or who you are as a mother and who you are as a child, right? All of these things need congruence. And for so long, even today, more traditional mindsets would really force that separation. And I think that if we were to invite others into this dialogue about how to embrace this, if we framed it as maybe inviting people to bring their whole selves to work, would be a way to maybe frame that without using trigger words. And maybe those words are just triggers for some and not others.
Well, I am going to actually have a little debate here because I don't think it's that much of a trigger word, or it's not as much of a trigger as some people tend to think, especially the concept of love. If I think of any successful entrepreneur, they have loved what they do. They love their business. They love a problem that they're working on. And I mean, I'll show actually a poster I have here on the wall that a friend gave me. It's
Yeah.
a quote by Steve Jobs. The only way to do great work is to love what you do. And we think of someone like a Steve Jobs or an entrepreneur and say, well, of course, they're passionate. This is their love. But it's possible for, and actually should be the case, that everyone else in a business, that's what CEOs and founders and leaders are striving for everyone to share their love for that problem in that business. And when you get there and you have companies where everyone just loves what they do, they love the people around them, they love the problems they're solving, that leads to great companies and great work, versus when people hate what they do and resent having to come into their office.
Yeah, so I can agree with that, framed like that. But when we talk about love, one of the triggers is really about loving, appreciating, respecting each other, right, as people. And I think that's where it starts to become a little bit uncomfortable for some, because that's not a normal feeling that you bring to the office. And in fact, if you bring it to the office in the wrong way, it's inappropriate, right? And so how do you balance that we're on the word of love, so how do we balance that?
It's finding the right way to express it. There are different kinds of love. I love my wife in a way that I don't love other people, and like I love my friends and family in different ways. I love it, and that can come through with colleagues and others as well. But you're right. There has been this sense to a certain extent that businesses and office should be sterile, should be formal, and conscious capitalism has actively been trying to tear that down to a certain extent, where it is less sterile, it's more based on relationships. And that what I would go back to is that actually leads to people being able to be their most productive selves. There is actually a very strong connection between the relationships we have and appreciation for the other people we're around and doing great work. That's part of having love for what you do, love for a business, and love for where you're spending most of your waking hours.
Yeah, and I think if I were to just add on to that, it's about a genuine, authentic concern about other people. Not for the purposes of what it will create for you, but because they're a real human that has real things happening to them in their life, work, and otherwise. And so how do we have empathy and understanding for that, and invite that whole person in?
That's absolutely right. And everyone understands that, even the most financial, data-centered individuals, because they're human beings. And behind every number we work with, behind what businesses, products, and services are, is the fundamental purpose of business, which is to help other people out. It is about providing something that someone else will benefit from, and they will benefit you in return for doing it.
Yeah. We have a couple questions come in, but one is around this topic. And so before we move on, I'd love to get to it. How do we see conscious capitalism lending support to an inclusive workplace? We talk about diversity and inclusion, and that's more prevalent now than ever. And I actually prefer to also add, besides diversity and inclusion, add belonging to it. And that's another way of kind of looking at that. But how does this contribute to more diversity, inclusion in the workplace, more belonging, and getting over the inequities that we see today?
I think it all starts with recognizing that businesses should be places that create belonging, like you said, and that are places where everyone can benefit. Absolutely everyone from being a part of the business. And it's in some ways radical to take that approach that this should be a benefit for everyone. But that's actually where having a stakeholder orientation mindset comes into play to begin with. It's about thinking about how you benefit everyone instead of making trade-offs between them. That's where conscious culture comes in, where everyone, regardless of their backgrounds, should be welcome, should be able to bring their full selves into work, and that contributes to the success of the organization. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging are infused throughout conscious capitalism. And that's not to say that this philosophy gives you a checklist of things to do for that, because we don't have a checklist really for anything, but that's embedded in the values of conscious capitalism and should be properly expressed through it.
Yeah, it feels like to me, taking a stance on conscious capitalism is taking a proactive stance towards diversity and inclusion. However, that in itself won't create that, and there's a lot more that's needed to follow up clearly. So I don't want to imply one is equal to the other.
That's right. And that's actually the same thing for running a business on conscious capitalist principles on these tenets. And I'm not saying that if you build a business or run a business with a higher purpose, stakeholder orientation, conscious leadership, and conscious culture, that you're going to be successful. There are lots of businesses that start with the right values, have the right leadership, but they don't have the right business model, their timing is off, they do something wrong, and it doesn't work out. You still need to actually put this into practice. You need a revenue model, you need a strategy. These are things that inform all of those other actions within a business and the way that you approach leadership, though.
Well, so where does conscious capitalism fail, or the inverse of that being, what are the other elements that are required to make sure that that kind of movement or change can succeed?
I'm curious for you to actually answer that, Dustin, since you're running you're a conscious capitalist leader yourself, you're running businesses with this philosophy, and my default would be to say there's so much else out there that I couldn't just give a list. But it really is just paying attention to the ins and outs of the operations to make sure a business succeeds, stays active and productive for all of its stakeholders, and just a lot of hard work to figure out how to properly apply and run the business.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think like that you can't have a lack of business acumen or a lack of a business model that's relevant and commercially viable. So this isn't a substitute for bad business planning, right? And all of a sudden you'll be successful. And so for us, it's part of our ethos and part of our culture about how we operate. And but that in a vacuum would not create an outcome that anyone wants to be a part of. We'd all feel really good in it maybe for a couple of months until we couldn't afford the commercial side of the business to keep everyone employed, right? And I think that it's a good segue into this other question. That's the capitalism part of conscious capitalism is important to me, and embracing both of those unapologetically is also important. It's possible to be a capitalist and to be a conscious leader. But the question actually goes to something that I wasn't aware that was going on in your community, so you can shed some light on it for me, is some of the community of conscious capitalism is asking to drop the capitalism part of it. And so can you talk a little bit about that, or what's going on there?
Sure. There have always been people who have been turned off by the word capitalism. I mean, so like you were just setting up, I can't tell you how many times I've said to someone, "Oh, have you heard about conscious capitalism?" And they say, "That sounds like an oxymoron. You can't have both of them." And what we are actively trying to do, our vision of the future, is a world where conscious capitalism is actually redundant, where we don't even need the conscious part of our name, because that's just the way capitalism is both perceived and practiced. But it's going to take a while to get there. And until then, the word capitalism is going to be a trigger for some people. It's going to, and we have to get to the substance underneath that, what we mean, which I think most people would actually agree with and do agree with. But we also need to recognize that it does convey a certain system, a way of interacting with each other economically, what based on free exchange, that is important, while we also say we can also interact with one another in a more or a less conscious way, and we need to get to that more conscious way across the board.
Yeah, I love your vision for, if we're going to drop anything, and I'm not saying you said this, but we should be able to drop the conscious part, not the capitalism part, because conscious capitalism would be redundant with what capitalism means. If we get to that point, then this was wildly successful as a way of thinking and as a way of doing business.
It will be wildly successful. Or I would even go the other way. If just the conscious thing to do is also considered the capitalist thing to do, then that's success as well. Just let's get to a point where we are saying the same thing twice instead of people thinking we're saying opposite things.
So how far are we? I mean, we talk about tipping points and adoption curves, and there's a lot of theories about what percentage of leaders do you need. 10% comes to mind as one of those tipping points to really start to affect more massive change. But where are we at today in your mind? And this is obviously subjective. And how far are we from that vision?
Well, let's go back to the history of when things started to change here in 2008. There were some conscious capitalists out there, and they were some of the founders of the organization and the movement Conscious Capitalism. But when these ideas were presented in boardrooms or at conferences, they were laughed out of the rooms. They were not taken seriously by anyone. But then over the last 10 years, as groups like Conscious Capitalism have done a lot of work to spread these ideas, and more business leaders have come to realize this is needed and just a better way of doing business, we've seen some pretty amazing things change. It was only 3 years ago that Larry Fink wrote his first letter to CEOs, the head of the largest investment firm in the world, telling them they can't just look at maximizing profit. They need to adopt a higher purpose, and they need to adopt stakeholder orientation. The largest investor in the world saying that to every CEO. Then it was a year ago that the Business Roundtable adopted its new statement on the purpose of the corporation, which again said, we need businesses that have a higher purpose and stakeholder orientation, not businesses that only prioritize shareholder value and profits. Then if you look at the World Economic Forum this past year, everyone was talking about stakeholders and purpose. And when this COVID pandemic hit, there were a lot of people saying all of this talk about conscious capitalism or stakeholder capitalism is going to go out the window. Now that businesses are being crunched and they really need to survive, we're going to see them give up on these principles. But as Alan Murray, the editor of Fortune, has been documenting over the course of this pandemic, we've actually seen the opposite happen. More businesses are doubling down on their values and on their practice of conscious capitalism than those that are giving it up. And so I've always been saying it's going to take a long time to reach that tipping point. I was thinking a decade or two. I think we're only a few years away now, though, because business leaders are being inspired by these ideas. They see it's the future. The question is, are we going to be able to develop enough of those how-to resources I mentioned at the start of this conversation that they need in order to help them put this into practice? And what you're doing and calls like this are a great start and part of that. So I really appreciate you elevating this and not just having a single email on it, but a webinar series with your people, your stakeholders to dive into it, because that's how we get the conversation going and start to integrate this into more businesses.
Yeah, for me, it's really exciting to be a part of the dialogue and to contribute to it however we can, because it's really important to me. And we had the same experience that you had described during March as COVID started to hit in the United States. It started with me. I had to double down on my own kind of self-awareness and practices first, but then we had to double down on everything we stand for, and that's proven really valuable in really tough times. And if that's not proof for others to start thinking of shifting into this method of thinking, then at some point, hopefully, they'll start to see the intrinsic motivation and rewards that are gained from this way of thinking and doing business.
And well, if I can ask you a question to follow up on that, why did you choose to double down instead of sacrifice those values and just focus on the bottom line? And how did you go about doing that? Especially, how did you double down on your own conscious leadership when so many leaders are under so much stress in today's world because this is an unprecedented crisis we're living through?
Yeah, it is. And for the first time, it's a global crisis that we're all experiencing at the same time. And I think crisis is a really good opportunity for to show what leaders are made of, or kind of who will rise and who will not. And for me, the first way I kind of stepped into it, among several, but the one that came to mind as you were asking that question, is really around personal vulnerability and just sharing what I was experiencing. Because chances are good, as a human that works with other humans, they may be experiencing those things too. And for me to stand up in front of the organization virtually and act like everything's okay, or I've got it all together, would be inauthentic, one, and it probably would inspire less confidence than actually saying, I don't know what to do, or here's how I'm feeling, and I have anxiety about this. However, here's what I'm doing about that. Here's how I'm choosing to relate to that, so that I can push back into a productive place from which we can operate.
And what you're touching on, I think, is really at the core of conscious leadership. It's recognizing that you are a human and there are other humans out there that you impact, and all of the things that need to come with that: love, empathy, like we were talking about before, and being really smart, making the right decisions to generate revenue, to keep the business operating, but also think about the emotional impact on individuals, how you apply that systematically to not just a handful of people, but to hundreds or thousands that you are interacting with, and embody the values of the company and the values that you want everyone else in the company to have as well.
Yeah, and I think the key word that comes to mind is authenticity, as we had the earlier questions around how do I convince others, or how do I maybe manage others that don't necessarily share this mindset, or they talk the talk, but they don't necessarily back it up. I mean, that's a hard question. And I think the more that we can authentically operate from our position of values, which I find is a source of strength, then hopefully over time that influences others to come along with that. And there will be burns, I think, like we talked about earlier, and challenges, but I think that's what really tests the resolve towards, I was going to say a strategy like this, but it's not a strategy, it's a mindset.
Well, if I can ask, Dustin, what led you down this path to begin with? Because we can learn a lot about how to introduce this to others by reflecting on how this was introduced to us in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, my journey started around 2008, which started with a passion for culture and engagement. And this was very early days of what was called corporate social responsibility, right, or the double bottom line, or the different things that this has maybe been compared to. But for me, it was really about building a place where our people could grow faster than anywhere else. But really, it was also about building a place I wanted to go to work every day. And so it was not only for me, but it was for an environment for everyone where we could all thrive. But it started around culture, and it stayed with me with culture for a long time. The big shift for me happened about 3 years ago when I got introduced to the stakeholder orientation model. And so I was a culture maven, someone that was passionate about it, but never really had considered our stakeholders outside of our employees and our customers. And we don't have shareholders. And so to really expand that thinking around a stakeholder mindset, but specifically the idea of creating value for one without extracting value from another. So getting out of that zero-sum mindset. Not that that was something that was prevalent for us, but it was never an intentional way of thinking about things, was the big shift for us as the second chapter. And so I guess if I were to summarize that, if someone wanted to do that a lot faster than the last 12 years, which is what it took me, start with people and culture, right? But I think if I started with that stakeholder orientation in the beginning, I think that would have been hugely valuable to understand.
I think there's so much insight to that, because that really is a paradigm shift in a lot of ways, and it opens up the possibility of conscious leadership and everything else that comes with it, because it's getting to a mindset of abundance rather than scarcity is another way of thinking about it, right?
Absolutely.
So it's very easy to just look at all of your resources, all of your money, and just look at where things are right now and ask, how do I get the most of what exists? How do I get that for myself or my team instead? And that means I'm going to have to take from others or take from someone. And instead shift to, well, what are the opportunities actually to create more, to get to a place where you're just creating more value for everyone instead of thinking, I'm going to help this group rather than that other group. And that is an unlocking move in just how you think about business and how you think about leadership too, because that's how you can get to love and empathy and vulnerability in a business, because those aren't in conflict with making a profit or having a solid strategy. They are supplements to and even integrated into how you achieve that effectively.
Yeah, I can see that. It's been a really good shift for us, and it's not something that's hard to build a culture around. People, when they know that it's authentic and real, I think my experience has been people have been really willing to be a part of that and to contribute to it. And it's been really good. Well, I feel like part of becoming a conscious business or conscious capitalist, and I'm using that word on purpose, is not about necessarily having a nonprofit business, right? That whose mission is to create some kind of positive impact. And so I think maybe a lot of times it's confused or oversimplified to say, well, I don't have a business that is creating a positive impact, and so this doesn't apply to me. Can you think of any examples that would maybe look more commercial, right, in a business model or format, but they've applied this framework or this way of thinking to their business?
So I think you're talking about businesses that maybe don't have a product or service that seems to be changing the world,
Sure.
but still are conscious capitalists that have a higher purpose, even if it's not the product or service, or that's the way I'm going to answer it.
Yeah.
And here's one example. Take Grayston Bakery up in Yonkers, New York. They make brownies. That's all they do. Not healthy for you whatsoever. They're absolutely delicious. Not good for you though. They're in Ben and Jerry's ice cream. They're sold in grocery stores around the country. Amazing, highly successful company. But their product is not about making people better. I mean, it's pleasurable, it's enjoyable, it's great, but the product isn't what really defines them as a conscious capitalist business. It's the way that they approach their employees and their HR practices, where they say that they don't hire people to make brownies. They make brownies to hire people, and have created this amazing way of thinking about HR, where they don't have any application or interview process for the majority of their jobs. They have what they call open hiring, where there's a list in their office in Yonkers, New York. Anyone can walk in, put their name and phone number on the list, and when there's a job opening, they call that person up and say, "You've got a job if you want it."
Huh.
And they do not have any background checks. They do not have any interviews. They give everyone a chance to have a job and employ them right away. And they've built this incredibly successful company by upending HR and really looking at their purpose being to hire people and give people an opportunity that others won't. And they just happen to make brownies to do that.
Yeah, so that reminds me of the question, what business are you really in, right? And some might say they're in the bakery business, but what you described, and I'm sure they might say it a little bit differently, is they're in the business of putting like-minded people to work and creating a way for them to support their family. I mean, would that be fair, or how would you word it?
Yeah, I would take out the word like-minded because they welcome anyone. They're giving they're giving anyone a chance to have a job and provide for their family, to provide for a better life. And they happen to make brownies. So you're right. They would say that they're in the business of giving people a chance. And the brownies
Yeah,
are incidental.
I like that. So culture and engagement, conscious capitalism is important, but there are times where, especially during now, there's been a lot of CEOs or businesses that have been faced with really tough decisions, including furloughs and layoffs. And so how does a conscious leader in a conscious business operate in that type of environment when there's no other way but to go down that road?
That is such a difficult question, and one that unfortunately a lot of businesses have had to face these last few months. Businesses that have always been growing for 30 plus years. They've never had a layoff. They have always hired more people year after year, have had to lay off 2/3 of their workforce because they just don't have any revenue coming in. And I'll say from the outset, I don't think there is a single right answer to this because it's so complicated and difficult. But again, it goes back to the process that they use. How much are the companies and the leaders thinking about the impact on their employees and the ways that they can set their employees up for the most success? And we saw companies take different approaches for this, right? Danny Meyer from Union Square Hospitality Group laid his employees off so that they would have access to unemployment benefits. You saw other companies furlough individuals or go to part-time in order to keep them on payroll so that they would still have access to benefits and they would be able to maintain the relationship with their employees. We had some businesses take some people on their teams and make it their job to research other opportunities for the employees that they were going to have to lay off or furlough, so to help them out and get through this. There are lots of different ways that you can go about it that all could work. Some of them might not work too, but it's the conscious approach is to be conscious of what impact this is going to have if you have to go into layoffs and furloughs, and approach it with as much consciousness and love and support for people. I am going to use love there. How do you do this with love and in order to help them and their families as much as you can, even when making such a difficult decision?
Yeah, what I would add to that, and we were fortunate to not have to make those decisions and have been able to keep everyone on our team, but I have plenty of other peers that have had to go through that. And one of the keys that stood out to me was transparency and communication. And it was really surprising, the stories of, here's what's happened. We've lost 75% of our revenue. We will have to lay people off and or do furloughs. But employees volunteered. They asked for pay cuts instead. If we all took a pay reduction, could we save this many jobs? And so it was really surprising how much everyone's willing to step up and help out in that situation when there's authenticity and transparency.
I think you're hitting on something really key there, because that again respects them as another human being, to share what's going on and give them the opportunity to understand and be a part of figuring out what the solution is.
Yeah. Well, we are almost at time, and I want to give you a chance to say any parting words for us to inspire existing conscious capitalists or some that are thinking about pursuing that as a way of thinking.
Well, I'll tie this to the topic of this conversation, conscious leadership, and say that conscious capitalism is about conscious capitalists, which is about conscious leaders. And it's about everyone seeing themselves as a leader and has the opportunity to be a conscious leader. And you don't have to do this on your own. There are so many other people that are on this journey as well right now that are models to look up to, that are advisors that want to support you, whether it's at Headspring or Workify or at other businesses in the Austin area or globally in the Conscious Capitalism Network. Draw upon these other amazing people and examples and resources to help you on your own journey, and bring that to your work in being a conscious leader and a conscious capitalist, so we get to that future where conscious capitalism is redundant.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Alexander, for the conversation and the dialogue. I've really appreciated it, and I hope that it added some value for others out there as well.
Thank you for inviting me and for everything you're doing and just being you, Dustin, really.
With that said, we will sign off. Thanks a lot.